Good morning once again. It's time for today's AM Minnesota program. We're going to be talking about apples today. My guest in the program, David Bedford, who's the apple breeder at the University of Minnesota's Landscape Arboretum. Good morning, David, and thanks for coming back on the program. This has become quite a tradition in every September.
Yes. Well, thank you, Jerry. Glad to be back with you again.
I always enjoy talking about the apple industry and the apple breeding program at my University of Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. I remember you saying in other years there was only about like 2 of them left in the country, and we have one of them.
That's right. There's actually 3. So we're the one that represents the whole middle part of the U.S. and happy to be still in business.
And I'm thinking Washington State, and is it New York then?
Yes, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Well, I know farmers are just getting into harvest, and we're pretty excited about the yield potential in this year's crop. So does that mean we have a pretty good apple crop here in Minnesota, too?
Yeah. I think we're having pretty much the same results that the other farmers are having. We had the right weather at the right time, the temperatures and rainfall. It's one of the nicest crop I've seen in decades, maybe.
I remember a few years ago, it was so warm in the spring, and then it was early May, and it got down in the teens, and that kind of took the apples. They were blossoming at the time. That kind of hurt that year, I remember.
Yeah, that's just part of the roller coaster that we live with in the world of agriculture, and with apples in particular. Those spring frosts can really devastate the rest of the season. But fortunately, we don't have that too often. As cold as we are in Minnesota, our springs, by the time we get to apple bloom, usually we're pretty safe. But every now and then you get those odd events.
Our daughter is going to school in Michigan. I've been out there a few times this summer and this fall. And one time I had to fly into Detroit, rented a car, and drove a little over 2 hours to Mount Pleasant where she was at. And I saw a number of... I didn't actually see the apple orchards, but there were big signs, and you saw the big buildings like Uncle John's Cider Farm. So it must be pretty big in other parts of the country, too.
Well, that's right. Michigan is probably the largest in the Midwest in terms of apple production. They'd be number 3 in the overall country. And so they have conditions somewhat similar to us, but not as cold in the winter, of course. And so they have a little more acreage than we do.
And it seems like here in Minnesota, the actual production, the apple orchards kind of center in certain areas, so we must have like microclimates throughout Minnesota that are a little better suited than others.
Well, that's true, yes. Well, there's 2 factors that go into where the apple production is. Number one, the first part is that the northern half of the state is really pretty cold. Now, we do have varieties that will live there through the winter. But they don't have all the choices quite that we do here a little further south. So that kind of takes out some amount of the production from Minnesota. And then when we get into the south here, we have kind of 2 general regions. We have the area further south down by La Crescent, Minnesota, and sort of along the Mississippi and those high bluffs. And that's really nice apple growing region. That's where probably our larger volume growers are, the big wholesalers. But then the second area where we actually have more growers, maybe less acreage, but definitely more growers, is centered around the population areas. So, of course, the Twin Cities has a large number of, it would be smaller orchards, I suppose, but they can be up to 50 to 100 acres. But they're selling directly to the public. So that's kind of where the concentration, either in the far south in the larger orchards or up around Rochester and the Twin Cities.
Well, we have to take a break for the markets in about 40 seconds, David, but I wanted to mention right here around Faribault we have a number of local orchards, too.
You do have a couple very good ones there, so you're fortunate to have the option to go right out and buy direct from the grower.
Our guest on the program today is David Bedford, who's the apple breeder at the University of Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. And David, let's pick it up again, talking a little bit about the apple breeding program, one of 3 in the country there at the University of Minnesota. I distinctly remember one of the past years, you told me how that all came about when the settlers came in. Actually, it was apples they needed for survival.
Well, apples were very well thought of back then. Not that they're not now, but they were much more a part of daily life, I guess you'd say, or the desirable part of daily life. The life on the early frontier wasn't so easy, and of course they had to raise everything they ate and used. And apples were one of those real treats that they could grow. And so it was very important to them because they would have fresh apples, of course. They could have pies and sauce, dried apples. And then there was the little part of the early apple lore we don't hear so much about, but everything that didn't go into those uses went into hard apple cider. And that was kind of the entertainment end of the apple world, if you will. So they were very connected to their apples, and when they brought their trees with them from the eastern U.S., they ran into Minnesota winters, and that took care of almost all those trees within a few years. So they were pretty desperate to have something that could grow here, and eventually our program was funded to solve that problem. And so since that time, we've been working just about 108 years now on the problem, and we've introduced 27 apple varieties during that time. So we've made some good progress, I think.
How did they go about it back then? How did they find the different varieties of apples that maybe had that characteristic of winter hardiness that they could develop an apple variety that could survive in Minnesota?
Well, the first thing is you have to find some apple that is hardy. And so that, of course, was the first part. But what they were able to find was you can always find some either wild or in this case, some Eastern Russian or Northern European varieties that weren't very good quality, but could at least survive. And then with that, when you have the hardy genes in, then you can start breeding in the quality genes. So it's really a matter of starting with something that will survive and breeding in something that's desirable to eat.
One of the keys, too, with apples that were so storable. In other words, you could make applesauce and things that would, keep for a long time, and even just apples themselves, if you kept them kind of cool, they could survive for a long time.
Well, that's right, and we still look at that trait very heavily. Of course, back in those early days, their storage conditions were pretty primitive, and the best they would hope for is basically a root cellar, and that actually is quite functional storage, but not quite under the conditions that we have nowadays. We store apples in large quantities, and when they're in wholesale conditions, right just barely above freezing. They'll be stored at 32 or 33 degrees, and therefore can last 6, 8, 9 months or longer. A root cellar, I'm guessing would probably be in the 40s, 50s, something like that, so much less time. But, they weren't looking at having to have the perfectly crisp apple that we expect nowadays. Their standards were a little lower, and they were looking basically for edibility, not necessarily the highest culinary levels that we achieve now.
And nutrition was a big deal, too, isn't it? What's the old saying? We've all heard it. An apple a day keeps the doctor away.
Yeah, that's right. And the other thing that people often don't know is what is the most healthy, the most nutritious part of the whole apple?
The skin?
Well, the skin. Yeah. And so I just shudder when I watch people peel an apple because you're just throwing away the most nutritious part. And I can tell you that there's very few recipes, even though they say peel apples and slice and this and that, there are very few recipes that actually need to have that skin removed. So I'm a big advocate of leaving that skin on when you make pies or tarts or anything like that.
You mentioned hard apple cider. I've heard of that. I've never tried it. Is that apple cider with some sort of adult beverage added, Or is the apples fermented and produce their own alcohol in the hard apple cider?
Yeah, it's the second. This is actually apples that are fermented, and just really the same way that wine is made, except they use grapes for wine. Well, hard cider is just regular fresh cider that's allowed to ferment, and of course, back in the early days, it would just ferment from the natural yeast that would be on the skin of the apples. So it pretty much happens on its own. Now, of course, if it's not done right and under controlled circumstances, you can also end up with vinegar, which is much less enjoyable to drink. Still very useful, but a whole different drink. And by the way, hard apple cider right now is the largest growing category in alcoholic beverages in the U.S. Now, it's still a tiny fraction of what beer and wine and everything else is, but in terms of its growth, it's very hot right now.
During the market break, John came into the studio, and he offered to come up and help you taste test the hard apple cider.
Well, I'll put him on that very, very long list. But thank you for that offer.
Why don't you explain a bit what's involved? You mentioned the University of Minnesota has developed over the years, those 8 years, 27 different apple varieties. And I wanted to put this on our website with a picture. I went out to the local grocery store and took a picture of a beautiful apple display grown locally over by Lake City. Sweet Tango. That rings a bell, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's one of our newest and best ones. One of my favorite personal favorites. And that's actually a variety that we produce by crossing Honeycrisp with one of our other recent introductions, Zestar, and looking to get the best of both. And I think we really did in this case. We got some of the Honeycrisp texture, which is the gold standard for what an apple should eat like in terms of texture. And then we got some of this intense flavor that we get from Zestar. So it really, I think, was one of those times when we got exactly what we were hoping for, and maybe even more. That flavor of the Sweet Tango is there's a high level of sugar and there's a high level of acid. And so tart lovers say, oh, I just love that zing of Sweet Tango. And sweet lovers say, oh, that's such a sweet apple. So it really has a little something for everybody.
Why don't you explain again some of the nutritional benefits of apples? You mentioned most of those are in the skin, but there's fiber, a lot of nutrients.
That's right, yeah. And I wouldn't say that most of them are there. It just happens to be the highest concentration. But you're right. There's a number of phytonutrients that do multiple things. But at the very least, just the fiber that's contained in an apple is wonderful. It's filling. It helps slow the digestion. And, this problem we have with diabetes and obesity in the U.S., I'll tell you, if everybody ate one apple a day, we'd cut those rates considerably, because an apple fills you because of that fiber. And then because of the fiber also, it breaks down more slowly in your system, your digestive system. So you don't get that big rush of sugar that you do with candies and sweets and that sort of thing. And those are the kind of things that help contribute to diabetes.
But yeah, you do get some natural sugars, that sweetness that maybe is good for you, a slow release.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it's satisfying. That's the main thing. Like we can talk about filling ourselves up with twigs and nuts and whatnot, but there's not so much enjoyment in that. And that's the beauty of an apple, is that it has all these nutritional and health benefits, and it's good to eat. It's fun to eat. And that's really what we're trying to produce more of in our breeding program, is something that gives you a memorable eating experience. I mean, there's no question that apples are good for you, but when we can make them enjoyable to eat, and for children too. I mean, that's really where we win this battle of obesity in the long run, is with our children. And so when we have an apple that kids will actually ask for, then we've made some progress.
And then, too, maybe someone said, well, I don't like apples. Maybe they had apples 20 years ago or longer, and, well, they didn't like it. Well, not all apples are the same. Look at all those varieties we have now, and I'll bet there'd be one that would meet your fancy.
Well, almost certainly there would be. And I have to tell you, I was one of those people that was raised on Red Delicious, and I didn't like apples because of that. I loved all sorts of fruit, but apples were my least favorite. And that was because I was raised on Red Delicious. And, it wasn't until I was in my younger 20s that I even discovered that apples could be something other than mealy, tough-skinned, bland-tasting Red Delicious. So if there's some of your listeners out there that haven't tried some of the newer varieties, by all means, get out and treat yourself to a whole new eating experience. And I think Honeycrisp is kind of the leader of the pack in that regard. If you don't like soft, mealy, flavorless apples, get yourself a good Honeycrisp. And by the way, I'd say get a local one if you can, because they're even better than things that are shipped in from, let's say, Washington.
And the nice thing is, you go to any grocery store, there's numerous different varieties, and there's sacks there. You can take as many as you want. You can take one and try it, take another one and try it, and find out which one you like.
Yeah, really, when you think of the whole rest of the grocery store, you really don't have that option, do you? I mean, if you go into the cookie section, you can't buy one cookie and try it. You have to buy pretty much the whole box. So I think that's a good point and something I hope people will take advantage of.
One of my vices is I'm trying to convince myself it is nutritious for me. And it always happens about this time of year. It shows up in the grocery stores as we start looking Halloween down out in the future. Carameled apples. Caramel and apples. Ooh.
It's a good combination, isn't it?
and I can convince myself that, well, maybe the caramel isn't real good for you, but you're getting all the good in apples, so maybe it's an offset.
Well, that's right. Yeah, and for what it's worth, they always leave the skin on the caramel apples, so you're getting the full nutritional value at least.
And then sometimes they when the caramel's still soft and they put it on, then they put some nuts on it too. Now you get lots of protein, right?
Well, I'm not going to enable your your addiction there, but I will say the apple part is good for you. I'll agree with you there.
Now, when you were crossing the Honeycrisp and the Zestar, and so after that cross, it takes a while before, if I remember correctly, you grafted it onto an existing tree. All right, now you have an apple. You actually plant the seed, see if it grows, and see what develops, and you wait a few years to see if you got lucky with a cross or not so lucky?
Well, that's right, yeah, except that we do this by the thousands. Every year we generate about, between 3,000 to 5,000 new trees from our breeding efforts. So each one of those trees is a unique individual. And sometimes they'll be full brothers and sisters. They'll come from the exact same parents, but each one will be a unique individual. And it takes about 5 to 6 years before those trees start bearing fruit. But once they start bearing fruit, then I have to taste each one of those. And so every day I have to taste about 500 to 600 apples. And during that time, I'm finding I'm throwing away most of the ones I'm tasting. They're just not quite up to the standards that we have nowadays. So every year I throw away about 3,000 trees that don't make the grade, and I find about 10 to 12 that are good enough to go on for further testing. So those ones that go on for further testing, then we'll propagate those, we'll graft those, and look at those for another 5 to 15 years. And during that time, most of them get thrown away too. So by the time we release a variety like the Sweet Tango or the Honeycrisp, we'll have gone through about 10,000 trees that didn't make the grade. So we're looking for the real cream of the crop here. And so when we do find that we release something, you can be assured that it's not just the first thing we came across that tasted good for 1 year. It's got some years of testing behind it.
So how many years does it take then from that initial cross thinking, okay, I think Honeycrisp and Zestar might produce a good cross, till we released Sweet Tango?
Well, for example, if we go back a little further to Honeycrisp, that was 30 years from the start of the breeding till the release date. Sweet Tango was a little faster. That we got down to 22 years. And we're trying to squeeze it down a little bit more, but I don't think we're going to get down to too much below 20. So it's a long-term investment in time, and that's, of course, what the university is perfect for. They're here today. They were here 100 years ago, and hopefully somebody will be doing this 100 years from now.
So actually, if you're an apple breeder, you might actually develop one or two apple varieties in a career.
Yeah, that's right. You hope you have a couple good successes, and I've been here. I'm in my 37th year, so I've had the pleasure of being involved in a few, and actually that brings up, I'll tell you some of the ones that your listeners might watch for, some of our newer, better apples. We go to the beginning of the season. The Zestar, I think, is the first good apple of the season, and that would have been picked, just about a month ago now. Sweet Tango would be the next one, and that's around the 1st of September. And that one should still be in the stores now, and still a wonderful, excellent apple. Then we'd come to the Honeycrisp, of course, and that one is in season now. It's being picked locally, and as I mentioned earlier, that's where I would advise your listeners to go get your local apples. The ones in the store sometimes are local, but a lot of the Honeycrisp we get in the stores come from Washington. And not that that's all bad, but you got to remember this apple was bred for Minnesota conditions, so it still grows the best and tastes the best when it's grown in Minnesota. So I'd still recommend going local when you can. And then we have another variety, one of our newer ones, that's just probably about a week away from harvest now, and that's a wonderful sweet apple called Snow Sweet. And that one you'll have to, not in the grocery stores yet, but you can find that at local orchards. And that's a wonderful apple for those people that don't like so much acid in their apples.
Say you find one, you really like the Zestars, and maybe they aren't showing up in the grocery stores or they're all picked already. You could buy a good supply, store them in the refrigerator then? How's the best way to keep them at home?
Yeah, that's right. The cooler, the better, and some apples store longer than others. So Zestar, for example, store about a month to a month and a half. Sweet Tango store for about 2.5 to 3 months. Honeycrisp store for 6 to 7 months. So really depends on the apple in terms of how much I'd recommend buying. But the one key to any apple storage is the cooler they are, the longer they last. And that's another thing to consider even when you buy a small quantity. I see people leaving them out on the countertop. And you can do that, but just realize that every hour they spend on the countertop, they only have about a fifth as much storage life on the counter as they will in the refrigerator. So don't burn up your storage life needlessly by having them out on the counter. And if you like your apples, you like to eat them at room temperature, then just take a couple out every day and put them out, but not the whole bag.
I put some in the pantry, and all at once they kind of got shuffled around. You forget about them. You come back, who knows how long later, and they're kind of shriveled up.
Yeah. Then you've got applesauce apples. That's what they're good for.
You mentioned, David, you've been there for 30, how many years?
I'm in my 37th year, yeah.
So that means you aren't quite as young as you used to be. Are you, as the industry as a whole, are we training apple breeders as an interest? Because obviously there's a need there.
Yeah, well, we're a very small niche of agriculturalists, so I think there'll be people that'll be ready to fill my shoes when I'm ready to give them up.
Do you have some graduate students, or who helps you keep track of planting all these trees and harvesting them and everything else?
Well, we have some staff here at our research facility, and some of those are graduate students. Some of those are just full-time employees that do different support functions of this. We're a team, so I'm just one part of that team. And, somebody has to make sure that the trees get fertilized and sprayed and grafted. So it's a group effort.
A lot of times folks think, I want an apple tree in my backyard or a plum tree. And I remember growing up, went over to my grandpa's Elkville silo, and that was always the thing. They had some apple trees. And most of the time you went out there and they had nice apples till you picked one. And guess what was in it? A little extra protein tunneling through it.
Yeah. Well, we still have those little buggers. We haven't solved that problem. And so, depending on your location, most people will need to put a few sprays on their apples just to keep them from getting infested.
My point is, it's probably easier just to go to the grocery store or the local orchard.
Yeah, well, that's right. Everybody has to decide how much effort they want to put into it. But we are blessed, as you mentioned earlier, by having local orchards around many of our big and little towns. So, it's really, in many respects, easier to do that. Plus, you can get probably a wider variety of apples than you're willing to maybe grow in your backyard.
David, I can't believe we only have about a minute left, but if folks wanted to find out more, how do we do this? Is there a website they could go to that would?
Yes. Unfortunately, I don't have the exact address for it, but if you go into the University of Minnesota and look up fruit, apples, or fruit culture, you should be able to direct yourself.
Kind of navigate through there then.
Yeah.
Quickly,
right.
too, obviously, this is a long-term budget. Do you get like royalties off the varieties that you've released that help fund the program in addition to, just being based part of the university?
Well, we do. That actually is becoming a larger and larger part of our survival, is having varieties that do return some royalties. So without that, I'm sorry to say our program would be pretty much gone by now. So we're very dependent on having varieties that can generate some royalties for us. Yes.
Well, thank you for your time, David. I always enjoy visiting with you, bragging about our apple breeding program at the University of Minnesota's Landscape Arboretum.
Well, thank you. My pleasure to be with you again, Jerry.
My guest in the program today has been David Bedford, who's the apple breeder at, once again, the University of Minnesota's Landscape Arboretum.